So I want to start with going back and reviewing the really mega structure that I'm looking at. And let me start with this board over here and save a little space for later and say that within the ancient world that we have Israel here, and its neighbors are the Mesopotamians and the Egyptians. And there'll be Hittites up here also. And I'm interested in locating the law within the broader story. Now, for years and years, I've taught some of this in Africa, but I've never had the time nor the resources to sit down and ask carefully, although I knew the question was there, to ask, how would it sound within the story? So this is our fundamental principle of reading within the story. How would it sound within the story if I, as an Israelite, had before me the Pentateuch, in particular Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, the part that contains the embedded law code, and if I were reading this in my four-room house in Bethlehem, and if we had just had travelers coming through, which they did, on the great trade routes from Mesopotamia or from Egypt, and that was a very common thing. Israel was not isolated. There was a lot of traffic going back and forth, and Israel had just escaped from 400 years of living in Egypt, all right? So they understand Egypt. They know Mesopotamia. If I was sitting in my room reading this law, which is not likely because there weren't very many copies around, or rehearsing this law, how would it sound vis-a-vis my neighbors? How would it sound in the ears of an Egyptian? How would it play out in Mesopotamia? How would it echo in the Hittite culture? Now, I must tell you again, I'm not a particularly safe guide through this swamp, and we may be taken down by crocodiles at any time. But I do want to try to tiptoe through this swamp with you and to at least give you some clues as to how it probably works. And let me say again, I think one of the clues here is that when we're comparing the cultures and looking at the law, that there are very specific case laws in the law, which we'll look at, and you find the Code of Hammurabi here, which is one of 7 or 8, but by far the most famous set of case laws. They're lists. They're not really codes, they're lists. And there are striking similarities between these lists about the ox, about slaves, and general agreement about murder, about adultery, about many things that they have in common. But, when you compare the larger law and how it works, the law in Mesopotamia and the law in Israel are extremely different. And it's those points of difference that I want us to try to grasp. Because my thesis is that the witness of Yahweh to the world rests squarely on the 2 great pillars of the mighty acts of justice done at Exodus, which we know reverberated throughout the Middle East. And the other one is it rests upon Israel's obedience to the law, which creates a society with a just social shape. So you've got these 2 great, powerful engines of witness to Yahweh outside the culture. What he's already done, which Jethro heard about, and Ruth knows, Rahab the harlot knows about, and other people know about outside. Those are great testimonies to Israel, God's mighty acts of justice. The other witness, I'm going to suggest, and we'll get to the text that shows this clearly in a couple weeks, is that obedience to the law created a society that in its shape, and I'm using that word carefully and I will try to define my term, that in its shape was radically, absolutely radically different than everybody else. Let me just give you the obvious statement, and we'll come to this again. Israel had no king. Israel had no king. And depending on how you date the Exodus, early date or later date, it had no king for somewhere between 400 and 200 years. That's longer than America has been around, isn't it? Israel had no king. And if you understand anything about the ancient Near East, you understand that everybody else has a Hammurabi or a Pharaoh, right? To not have a king is absolutely unthinkable. It's like playing Monopoly without money. I mean, how can you play nation without a king? Can you play Monopoly without money? Of course not. And you're saying Israel plays nation without a king? And the answer is yes. The answer is yes. All right? So just put that in your back pocket somewhere, take it home. And we'll come back to that today at the very last. I will try to amplify something of that. But this is the power of the witness, and we'll eventually get to that. All right, let me just rehearse quickly where we are. I'm looking at 3. There's actually 4, 5, 6, and you have them in the notes. Differences between Israel and ANE is my shorthand for ancient Near East. You know that jargon? I hope you learn. That means Mesopotamia and the Egyptians. The Egyptians don't have laws. They have ma'at, which is an idea about justice, but they don't have codification of laws as far as anybody knows. It's Mesopotamia that has these kinds of things. And so when we compare Israel really with Mesopotamia, at the genre level, we talked about this last week very quickly, the Israelite law, when you read Exodus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, it's embedded in and told in a story. It's not freestanding like Psalms or Proverbs or the prophets. It's not a piece you can pick up and move around. It's networked, it's embedded in a story, and that's extremely important. The Code of Hammurabi is freestanding. It's on a stele. You can go see it in Paris in the museum. It stands by itself. It's not part of a story. It has an epilogue in which the king says, I'm a wonderful king and I'm going to do justice, and a prologue, and an epilogue which says, see, I'm a wonderful king, I'm a king of justice. All right? But it's not part of a story. It's not God building a just society. They both have lists, but the lists in Israel are treaty stipulations. That is, they're part of a larger covenant God is making with Israel that has the form of a treaty. We'll come and talk about that later. And the lists are part of the treaty stipulation. The lists over here are simply freestanding. In Israel, you have what's called apodictic, thou shalt not laws, and case study laws. If so-and-so happens, then such and such is the case. With very few exceptions, the law in the ancient Near East, and with no exceptions whatsoever, the Code of Hammurabi, is entirely case study laws, all right? I hope that you spent your spare time on Saturday not watching those foolish basketball games. We knew who the winners were going to be anyhow, but you spent the time clicking on the Avalon website of Yale University Law School, and you read the Code of Hammurabi. I can tell by looking at you, some of you didn't do that. But if you did, you know that every single one starts out and says, if so-and-so happens, then you do this and this, don't you? And while Israel certainly has that, it has the apodictic laws, which are distinctive, not unique, and then it has the Ten Commandments, which actually are unique. There's nothing like the Ten Commandments in the ancient Near East. Nothing like it. And eventually we'll get to that, and we'll talk about that. And clearly, the Ten Commandments are the central engine for justice, and we'll explain it in that way. Authorship. In the ancient Near East, it is Hammurabi, with the blessing of the sun god, who promulgates the law. But when you read the law carefully, it says, I, Hammurabi, am telling you these things. These are my laws. When you read the law of Moses, it's not the law of Moses or the Mosaic law. That's really a misnomer. It is God giving the law through Moses. And when we read the Ten Commandments, it says, God spoke thus. And it's the authorship is God. So the law in Israel is God-given. The law in the ancient Near East, the king is the lawgiver. Now, I suppose you could argue that in Israel, God is the king, and I certainly would accept that, and that's understandable. Which means this, that the law, especially in Egypt, as we saw last time, that the law and its religious base are separated, especially in Egypt. But in Israel, the law and ethics are intertwined because God gives the law, and so legality and morality go together, whereas legality and morality don't necessarily go together in some of the situations in the ancient Near East. Now, today I want to take up the scope, but before I do that, on page 4, I just want to take you through very quickly 6 implications that we can draw from the fact that the law in Israel is God-given. The most obvious one is that it's the truth because God speaks the truth. Now, obviously, we're working with certain assumptions here, and I don't need to even lay those out for you, I don't think. But working from those assumptions, the law is truth because God speaks it as truth. The second thing to say is there's only one standard because there's only one God. But if you have multiple gods or multiple kings, then you can have multiple and conflicting standards. But since there's only one God, there's only one standard. Now, as a footnote, I need to say to you carefully, if this series of talks was given to you by a standard liberal mainline Protestant trained at Harvard or Yale or wherever, you'd get a very different story. That the Pentateuch is made up of sources, J, E, P, and D, and that these sources are used to reconstruct how the law came together in a rather sophisticated way. It didn't actually all come together until very late, Josiah, and even after Josiah into the exile. It wasn't given by Moses. And J, E, P, and D is used to explain the conflicts that they see between the laws. Right? And we'll talk a little bit about that when we get to the slave laws and perhaps the laws on women. There are some issues and some problems with how you make the law work and put together. But is the answer to revert to a J, E, P, and D type of theory? And I don't take that path myself. And quite honestly, Protestant mainline liberal scholars, especially under attack from Jewish scholars, have backed off from that. And although it was in the ascendancy after Wellhausen and others set it forth 100 years ago, it's not really very much in the ascendancy now. Now, it's a closed footnote. So if your kids go off to college and take a course in Old Testament, they're going to get this main line, and you just, at least you've heard about it. And I'm not trying to tackle that problem here, although there are people who've tackled it. A third inference that can be drawn is that while the laws in the ancient Near East are legal, they're not necessarily moral. They're legal but not necessarily moral. Prostitution in Nevada is legal, right? But we wouldn't think it was moral. So laws don't necessarily imply morality. But in the Scriptures, because God gives these, we would think that the laws are also matters of morality and ethics. All right? Now, lots of things to explore there, and I just will state that and let you think about that. A fourth point, and I've made this point before, but I think it's worth making again, is that Israel's behavior, as we'll see in the Ten Commandments and beyond, is to be modeled on God's behavior. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt is not just a throwaway line at the head of the Ten Commandments, it's the foundation. And then he's going to say, you see, I'm the God who brought you out of Egypt, and everybody knows that that was a mighty act of justice. I'm a God who does justice, and now I'm going to require you to maintain justice. So the Ten Commandments say, I'm a God who does justice, and I want you to maintain justice. 1 through 3, maintain justice with me. 4 through 10, maintain justice in society. We'll come back and talk about that. But the important thing here is to understand that Israel is to behave like God, and they have seen God behave in the narrative. They've seen what God did to Pharaoh. They understand that what God did to Pharaoh was retributive justice. They understand that what God did to them, bringing them out, was distributive justice. They understand that God is the kind of God who puts his hand into space-time history on behalf of the bruised, the afflicted, the poor, the needy, the marginalized, and seeks to restore them to just communities. They understand that's the kind of God they're dealing with, not because they've read it in a textbook with abstract propositions saying that he's that kind of God, but because they've seen him in the storybook of the Bible actually behaving that way. So their behavior is modeled on, rooted in, and motivated by the narrative of the text. Nothing like that at all in the other ancient Near Eastern documents. Just nothing. And so it's really quite unique that we have this, and we want to hold on to that. And then fifthly, because God speaks the law, to disobey the law, that is to commit a crime, is actually to commit a sin. Are you with me? Hammurabi doesn't say that when you break the law, you've sinned. He says, and we'll look at the law next week, if you punch out someone of your own equal, you punch out their eye, then you get your eye punched out. All right? It's this sort of thing. But he doesn't talk about sin, and he certainly doesn't talk about atonement. Right? But the Bible, because sin is the problem, crime is a sin because crime breaks God's law and is therefore a moral issue, and one has sinned against God, then crime needs to be atoned for. You have nothing like that in Mesopotamia. They don't know anything about atoning for that kind of law breaking. But there'll be a great deal about that, and eventually when we get to the tabernacle, it'll be spelled out in even more detail. And then finally, and this is a transition to our next section, it's interesting, and I will read you the verse out of the RSV because the NIV obscures a little bit. In Deuteronomy 16:18, which is the beginning of a section of about 3 chapters, 16, 17, 18, that deals with what I will call the polity of Israel, that in Deuteronomy 16:18 it says, you, and it's you, Israel, you shall appoint judges and officers in all your towns which the Lord your God gives you. And this becomes the basis then for the distribution of power within Israel among a number of people. It is argued by people like McComasville and others that God's intention here is that Israel doesn't have a king. It's kings that appoint judges, isn't it? And officers. Doesn't have a king. What do you have? You have the people, and you have the older ones, the elders, but these people are asked to appoint kings. Now, it's not the first time we've seen that in the storyline. We saw it earlier in Exodus 18, and we'll see it again. That you have this flavor that runs right through a good deal of the scriptures until you get to the monarchy, of the idea that the people themselves are the ones responsible for their governing officials, and they appoint them. You can be sure that Hammurabi was not appointed by the people. Yeah. You can be sure that Hammurabi was not appointed by the people. Now, let me just read you my summary statement down at the bottom. Let's pause for a minute at this high point in our journey, that is a high point in the sense of looking back over this, and look over the terrain covered, and then look forward to where we are going. Reading within the story, and that's really my fundamental motif here, enables us to realize that the law is not just a set of legal statutes, if and then case studies, as is the situation with the laws of the ancient Near East, of which the Code of Hammurabi is the classic example. The law also expresses moral imperatives in its apodictic expressions of thou shalt and thou shalt not. These expressions, although not unique in the ancient Near East, you do find a few others, certainly are distinctive to Israel, and the Ten Commandments as a cluster of apodictic thou shalts actually is unique. Nothing like that. Such moral expression in the law of Moses comes from God as the author, not a human king such as Hammurabi. Now, looking forward, and we're going to look quite a ways forward here, looking forward, there's a huge vista which we have yet to survey. The law is not less than a set of legal regulations with appropriate punishments for infractions and a set of moral commandments. It is that. It has its lists. Some of the lists are very strange. You will not cook a goat in its mother's milk. And I'm sure that none of you have been guilty of that. All right? But you say, what in the world is that all about? What's that doing in the list? And there are lots of other such laws in the list, and they send us away scratching our heads. So it has those. It has its lists of case study laws and its legal prescriptions and its moral commandments. If we read the law through the lens of Paul, or what we think is the lens of Paul, and in the discussion section off camera today, we'll start a discussion on that. If we read the law through what we think is Paul, we will read the law as if it is only a collection, a list of legal and moral statements. It's a to-do list to get to heaven. I mean, that's a shortened version of the idea, isn't it? The Ten Commandments are a 10-rung ladder, and I carefully climb up to heaven. I mean, that's surely the preconception that most of us bring to the text. And I'm suggesting it's an entirely wrong preconception. If, however, we read from within the story, we shall see that the law, Torah, its larger name, which simply means instruction, is much more. We shall discover that the law, the Torah, also is, and here I'm going to list three very large areas that eventually we will get to. One is its instruction, that's what Torah means, its instruction about cleanness and purity. And there's no escaping that. I hope you've been reading the law. I mean, that's part of the course, isn't it? And if you're reading it through, you know, you're going along and having all these wonderful moral statements, and then all of a sudden it starts telling you, now if it walks on the ground and you can't eat this, and you say, what's that about? And it's woven in with the rest of the law, right? It's not in the footnotes or off to the side. It's right in there, as if it was important. And indeed, it is. It is. And so you have instructions about cleanness and purity, which are linked to holiness. And holiness is the key to the maintaining of a just society. Now, I'll have to unpack that later, but I just assert it now as an insertion to be unpacked later. Secondly, its instructions about the tabernacle. But the tabernacle, I would suggest for you, is a place for obtaining justice, not just justice with God via the atoning sacrifices. It surely is that, but it doesn't stop there. It is also a place of justice via the priest's teaching and administering the law. You can go to the priest as the Supreme Court and get a difficult case settled. You can go to the priest, and it's the priest who teaches the law. It's their responsibility to read and to teach and to promulgate the law. They are the Bible teachers of the day. And in that sense, they are justice teachers. And then thirdly, it is instruction about political and economic structural arrangements for Israel, so that it will become the just society which God so passionately desires it to be. Or to put differently, the law, the Torah, forms, I choose this word very carefully, the constitution for Israel, as a newly emerging nation. So again, to go back over here to my diagram and to say my conclusion, then I'll come back to it, that in Israel, the law stands as the constitution that supports the whole structure of Israel. Whereas over here, the Code of Hammurabi, while it certainly lays down very specific legislation and penalties for infractions, it is not a constitution. It is not a constitution. And I want to suggest that the Mosaic Law is radically different in that it forms what I think would best be described as a constitution, because it tells you how the society is to be regulated. Now, while we're working at the macro level, let me make just two other statements. In Western ethics, and we're certainly concerned about ethics, aren't we? In Western ethics, it gets divided up into personal ethics and social ethics. I mean, this is the way the books are published, isn't it? And you have some, and I've read some. I want to suggest that that kind of division is entirely foreign to Israelite scriptures. It's not the way ethics work in Israel. It's not really the way ethics generally work in traditional societies. And that while the Ten Commandments perhaps can be taken as a personal ethical code, it's not disembodied from the rest of the law, and the rest of the law provides the structural framework within what you might call a personal code works. But the personal code was not made to stand alone and to function alone apart from the larger structural piece. And I think what happens when we deal with the law is we focus on the Ten Commandments because we can sort of get our teeth in that, and we say, aha! But that's not really the law. It's part of the law. It may be the center of it in some ways, but there's much, much, much more to the law. It's a constitution, and it frames the society. Now, quickly, let me outline that framing, and then we'll come to a close. Under the scope of the law, then, how broad is the scope of the law? And I'm going to suggest that the scope in Israel is much broader than it is in the ancient Near East. And here I'm simply going to outline these, and then we'll come back, and each one is a whole lecture or two by itself. But it's what we're going to look at now that really is, and I've been using the metaphor, do you smell the fuse on the stick of dynamite? I need to upgrade my metaphor, and I need to have some sort of metaphor that talks about, do you hear the clock ticking on the atomic bomb? I mean, sticks of dynamite, oh, they're dangerous, and you don't want them hanging around in your backyard when your kids are playing. But an atomic bomb can level a whole place, can't it? And what we're working on now, I hope you can hear the clock ticking on this atomic bomb. It really is an atomic bomb. And this is the part that, by and large, evangelicals have gone right over the top of and have missed out. I'm not quite sure why, probably in part because of the way they've read law. I think probably in part because they've read outside the story, they've read Paul back into it, and they've read it without paying attention to how it works in the ancient Near East. And I think it's partly because, as a radical Western individualist, and I'm certainly one of those, I don't pay attention to structures. And so I bring all those preconceptions to the text. But if I can leave them at the door of the text and come into the world of the text and try to live within the text, read within the text, read the story as it plays out in the ancient Near East, leave behind my radical individualism and think about what the text is actually saying to me, then you can begin to hear the clock tick on the atomic bomb. All right, 4 areas in 3, polity, economics, which has 2 areas to it, and religion. And I'm using polity here simply to mean structural arrangements, how things are put together. It's a rather amorphous word if you look it up in the dictionary. And for me, polity has to do with the structures that pertain to offices and officers in Israel namely the prophet, the priest, the judge, and maybe a king. And primarily, but not exclusively, this little piece is drawn from Deuteronomy 16 through 18, which we'll look at in some detail. Let me just outline it for you. Chapter 16 says, you, and we've already looked at that, and that's radical, you appoint the judges, not the king. It's not feudalism. It's not working from the top down. It's working from the bottom up. If the judge doesn't turn out to be a good one, the people get rid of him, not the king. There isn't any king. So the judge is responsible to the community for judging. And the judges, as you might expect, must judge justly. The next group of people are the priests, and they teach the law, and the judge and the priest, and I'm not quite sure how this works out, oftentimes are paired together in the judicial procedures. And we'll have to talk about that as best we can. It's a little hard to get it, but the priests also have judiciary functions along with offering sacrifices and along with teaching the law. It's interesting, I think it is, it's interesting that the priests, who are all Levites, of course, are dependent. Now, I hate to say this to you because you'll think I'm a bad teacher, and I don't want you to think that, but probably it's true. The penny dropped for me earlier this week when I was reading the text again, but paying attention to the ancient Near East, all right? And I know enough about Egypt, and I hope that you know enough about Egypt to know that the second wealthiest class in Egypt, right under the Pharaoh, were the priests. And they legitimated and maintained the Pharisaical, not the Pharisaical, but the Pharaoh's understanding of their divine legitimation in their roles. So the priest said, yes, the gods have really said this. And the pyramidical society of Israel, reflected in its pyramids literally, where the Pharaoh and his family are at the top, and then the priests, and then it spreads out into poverty and people going down. In Israel, the priests never got rich. Among all the people, the priest had no land. Now you say, well, I don't have any land either. Yes, but you're not a farmer, and you don't live in an agricultural society. But your great-grandfather did, when 97% of all the people in America were farmers, right? Now it's what, 2%? So we don't know anything about farming. But farming was the way of life, and land was your capital, wasn't it? God said to the priests, you can't have any capital. You have to be dependent on the gifts of the people. You're Levitical. The priests never became powerful people until much later when they corrupted the system. And they do that, and we'll get to that. But the foundational principle was, priests don't have power, judges have to tell the truth, they have to judge justly. Prophets have to speak truth. You say, that's obvious. Well, yeah, it's obvious to us, but you will know that Israel at one point was awash in false prophets, wasn't it? Yeah. And so the idea of a prophet telling the truth is not something to just be passed over. It limits the prophet's scope, doesn't it? If you have to just tell the truth, I mean, what would happen in America if we had a whole year when the Democrats, yes, the Democrats, and even the Republicans, yes, the Republicans, had to tell the truth? Probably wouldn't be much to be heard. Yeah. And we all laugh because we know that is true. And they have these terrible things called truth and fact checks on the internet now, and they can blab something on Sunday night, and on Monday morning they have the document hanging on the internet saying, well, as a matter of fact, it wasn't 3,000, it was 39. Oh. You know, and you know, he didn't get his facts right. Prophets have to tell truth. Priests must live dependent. Judges must judge fairly. And kings, it says, if you ask for a king, and later in this class we will argue when we get to this time of Samuel, that Samuel argues on behalf of God that Israel shouldn't have had a king, but God knows that they'll probably ask for one. And he says, if you ask for a king, then, and there's 5 or 6 things that actually, if the king followed them, not many wives, not many horses, military power, not much money, must read the law, and must act as if he's one of the boys. Living Bible translation. I mean, when was the last time that you saw a king that acted as if he was one of the boys? Huh? No, you know. Prince William, and I like Prince William. He graduated from St. Andrews, which is dear to my heart, and he must be a nice guy if he did that. But Prince William doesn't live as one of the boys. He doesn't have to sit down and figure out whether he can really afford to go out to eat today, right? But the boys do. And Prince William, he just buys the restaurant and eats there for the day, right? He's in a different ball game. So, in polity, there's a very clear constriction of the power and disbursement of power among a variety of people. Now, it's taken me 45 years to get to that point. I will pause for 45 seconds and ask you to digest that. Do you understand that? That if you read within the story of Israel, what makes Israel radical is not the 10 Commandments. Well, it sort of does. But it's always been wrong to murder. It's always been wrong to steal. It's always been wrong to commit adultery. I mean, these aren't peculiar to Israel. But what is peculiar to Israel, what is unique, is the idea of no king. That's radical. And the disbursement of structural power across the board, and the limitation of these people. Now, very quickly, and we'll stop. In the economic sphere, and I've labeled this 1 and 2, there's the economic structures that pertain to time and the economic structures that pertain to space. In terms of time, the economic structure that pertains to time is the Sabbath. Now, let me just say, and later I will try to defend it, the Sabbath is not in any way, shape, or form a religious law. It is entirely, intentionally, an economic law. The Sabbath does not say, set aside the Sabbath to go to church. Well, there wasn't a church. Set aside the Sabbath to go to the temple. Not for 500 years. Set aside the temple to go to the tabernacle. Well, you got to hunt for the thing. It moves around, doesn't it? I mean, it's not in your backyard. Well, what do? Set aside the Sabbath as a day in which you don't work. It's holy, not in the sense that you go to church. It is holy in the sense that it's separate, all right? So it's a non-work day. So what do you do on the Sabbath? Not much. What do you do on the Sabbath? The biblical answer is not much. What do you do on the Sabbath year? Not much. What do you do in the Jubilee year? Not much. Along with returning all the land that you've rented from your neighbor who fell into poverty because he broke his leg, you must return all the land to your neighbor every other generation, every 50 years. So the Sabbath day, Sabbath year, a time of release of slaves and release of debts, and we'll take that up later, and the Jubilee, the Super Sabbath, 7 times 7, the 50th year, release of land back to their neighbors. The Sabbath is in no way, shape, or form a religious law, with one exception. The beginning of the Jubilee is on the Day of Atonement. And when you read the text carefully, it says, on the Day of Atonement, I release, that's the word, I release you from your sins, and on that day, you will release the land back to your neighbors. You will act like me. I will release you from your sins on the Day of Atonement, and you are to release the land back to the people that you rented it from. That's the only religious element in the whole Sabbath structure. Now, the second use of economic structure here is the business about land. Now, I've not read very much from the Bible to you today, and I feel bad about that. So turn with me to Numbers. I know you're religious and you want to read your Bibles, and so do I. So turn with me to Numbers, to perhaps the most boring chapter in the whole of Numbers. I hope you have a list of the most boring chapters in the Bible. I have a very long list of boring chapters in the Bible, don't you? Yes, and just exactly why they're in there, well, that's a good question to ask. And Numbers 26 has got to be one of the ones that when we read it out loud, for reasons I cannot comprehend, my wife skips most of it and doesn't start reading again until verse 51. The total number of men of Israel was 601,730. And I know your heart is warmed by that, as is mine. The Lord said to Moses, the land is to be allotted to them as an inheritance, look at this, based on the number of names. Now, if you don't get the point of that, the next line will help you. Look at this. To the larger group, give a larger inheritance. To the smaller group, give a smaller one. That's repeated verbatim in Numbers 33:54. I wonder if you understand, and I'll do this very quickly, what's going on. The big tribes that have 10,000 people get 10,000 hectares. The small tribes that have 1,000 people get 1,000 hectares. Everybody got how many hectares? Oh, one. The land is distributed equally. Now, I don't want to read backward into the story, but when Ezekiel thinks about this, Ezekiel actually uses the word equal in reference to this passage. I mean, it's not, this is not something I'm reading into the text. It's Ezekiel sees it in the text. The land was distributed equally. Land is capital. For the actual distribution, we'll read the story in Joshua when we get there. Now let's just pause for a second and think about something. The land's distributed equally, and every 50th year, you give the land back to the people who lost it. What kind of society is God creating? He's creating one that Joshua Berman, a good Jewish scholar, calls an egalitarian society. Now, I'm not sure I want to use that because egalitarian probably has the wrong sort of reverberations in your mind, and you're thinking socialist, and then you're saying, I bet he has red underwear on, and he's probably been to Moscow. No, I've not been to Moscow, and I don't think my underwear is red. I didn't check. And I'm not really a socialist. I'm a Christian, and I've come to believe in the whole Bible, which is very dangerous to do, actually. And God's clear intention is not only a distribution of power, but a distribution of wealth. And the approximate, and I use that word very carefully, the approximate maintenance of that. Now, the almost immediate response, both by left and right wing and by conservative and liberals, is, and I've been teaching this long enough to know that you're already thinking it, but I won't ask you to raise your hand. But they never practiced the Jubilee. Personally, I'm not so sure. And my argument is not that I can find something in the text. The text doesn't say either way. My argument's a fairly simple one, and that is, depending on how you arrange your chronology, archaeologically, it's fairly clear that the hillside Palestinian area where they lived when they moved in the time of Joshua, that for at least 200, 300, 400 years, right up until the end of the reign of Solomon, that the houses in Israel were all approximately the same size and shape. 200 years after Solomon disabuses the principle of distribution of power, in the time of Isaiah and following, the 8th century, 200 years later, the land distribution and the housing distribution has been absolutely radically altered. You have a few wealthy, you have masses of poor. We'll come to that eventually. So I'm not so sure that the Jubilee wasn't kept. We don't know, and I think archaeology probably leans that way, although I'm not an archaeologist, and I could be wrong on that, but I think it's a false assumption to immediately say, this is a fairy tale law. I'm not so sure it's a fairy tale law, utopian. Right? I think it probably actually was intended by Yahweh to work. to us, because of where we live and who we are and how we were brought up and with the dreams that we have in our heads. I'm an American, so it's the American dream, isn't it? That was inculcated into me from when I was a little boy. Such a society is just unthinkable. Just unthinkable. But maybe not by Yahweh. Maybe he's thinking those thoughts. And now the last institution, quickly. The religious structure, the tabernacle, I've already suggested about this. It's a place of justice for atonement through sacrifices, through the priest making decision in cases, and for the priest teaching the law. So the law is the standard of justice. The tabernacle, the other foundational institution, is the place to go, not just to worship. You do that, yes, but it's the place to go to obtain justice. Now, one more thought. We've had a lot of heretical thoughts today, and you've probably worn out all your red pens, so buy a new one for next week, all right? I want to suggest to you, if you read this story within the ancient Near East, there's another ticker going. It's a big bomb. You know what it is? How big was the tabernacle? About the size of this church. Maybe a little smaller. Made out of poles and canvas. Packed up, carried around people's backs. When it got finally across the Jordan, you had to say, hey, where's the tabernacle? Oh, last week it was in Shechem, but you know, they were on the road again. Yeah, I mean, you can actually trace, and I will do that for you, the movement, and it finally winds up in Philistia. You know that, don't you? Or at least the ark does. It's a movable, small, little thing. And for 400 years, they lived with a tent. And they were happy. And God was happy. And when finally someone said, I'm going to build you a great big tabernacle, a great big temple that looks like one of those ziggurats that you see in Mesopotamia. And God said, what? What? I've been traveling around tents for 400 years? You want to build me a what? Huh? We've got to talk about that, David. And we'll come to that text, 2 Samuel 7. I know it's there. I want to suggest for you that just as God didn't want a king, he didn't want a temple. And the word for king and the word for temple, that is, the word for dynasty and the word for temple, are the same word. It's Beth, house. The house of David and the house of God. And God doesn't want those houses, because when you go down that path, you look just like the neighbor. And all kinds of things happen. And those houses, that choice for the Beth, destroyed the just social shape of Israel, and in so doing, destroyed the power of the testimony of a righteous and just God to the nations outside.